So hopefully what you are looking at is a front screen that says Rochester History and Structural Racism. Is that what everybody's seeing? Again, just a quick show of thumbs up. All right, perfect. All right, so today we'll have a fairly abridged version of a presentation to kind of explore some of the challenges that we've really seen come to a head in this community over the last week, but that we know the kind of precursors of these challenges have been laid in this community over a long period of time. And I know if you're like me, have a certain level of curiosity around how we could get to a place like this in terms of what we're seeing in Rochester. I started to do a little bit of digging because I got really curious about what had happened in this community. And I got really curious about how the constructs, the underlying constructs came to be in Rochester. And so I started to do, frankly, just a little bit of homework. And this presentation is really done in that spirit. So the symbol that you see on your screen is known as Sankofa. And it's a West African symbol from the Akan region in Ghana. And what it means is go back and fetch it, or it's this notion that we look to the past to understand our present and to set the stage for a bright future. Because it truly is indeed understanding kind of where we've been that we can appreciate where we're going. As we get ready to jump in, there's a couple of quick concepts I just want to review with you really quickly, just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. The first is that today we are going to talk a little bit about structural racism. And I want to differentiate structural racism from some other types that we might be a little bit more familiar with, particularly that circle that says interpersonal racism. And interpersonal racism is generally what we think of when folks are hurling epithets. That's usually what we think of as interpersonal racism. The kind of thing that, at least in public, polite culture, has really become rather taboo. So we know those kinds of examples. Maybe a little less known is internalized racism, this idea that one can internalize and then act out on feelings of racialized supremacy or racialized inferiority. And that can affect both those that the system has acted upon and those that have been systemic actors. There's institutional racism as we think about organizations and institutions with which we are engaged or a part of, and they are a foci of decision making. And so they can make decisions that can be racist in practice. And then finally, there's structural racism. And that's really what we want to talk a little bit about today. This idea that deeply embedded in structures, there are interdependent and interacting features of racism. When we think of the criminal justice system, when we think of the education system, when we think of the healthcare system and the ways that decisions that get made impact the structure, literally how these systems are carried out. It's also important to note there's a little kind of cross symbol there, that all of these in the middle, all of these symbols interact with each other. All of these levels of structural racism. So sometimes in conversations, people say, well, we got to focus on the structure, as though you can do so without looking at the ways that one's own personal biases impact that structure, particularly for decision makers in that structure. So these are interrelated, but they give us a framework to kind of understand some of the different dimensions. And today, the dimension that we're really focused on is the structural. The other concept that I'd like you to dwell on with me is the idea of intent versus adverse outcomes. And so oftentimes in conversations about racism, because they do often depend on kind of at the interpersonal level, a lot of times the question is about intent, right? What did I mean to do? What did I mean to say? Perhaps I just said it clumsily, but that wasn't my intention. Even at the policy level, sometimes we have policies that have certain intentions, but then they have unintended consequences. And so what we want to talk a little bit more today about is adverse outcomes, that regardless of the intentions, what we see is adverse outcomes that seem to accrue to people of color that have lived in this wonderful town of Rochester, New York. And so again, you know, a lot of wonderful intentions, a lot of people that do nice things, but that sometimes the adverse outcomes continue to amount and accrue. And one example of that actually that I'll give you is if you think of public housing today, mostly we think of conditions that are pretty, you know, that have pretty deteriorated, adverse outcomes really in a very concrete way. Yet the public housing, at the time that it was created, much of it, it was intended to be a remedy to the tenements that had been really in fetid conditions all around communities around the country. And so it was supposed to be a solution, but yet it still had the same adverse outcomes, even if the intent may have been a positive one. So again, we're going to focus more on some of the adverse outcomes and less about intent. So with those concepts out of the way, why don't we just jump right in? So Rochester, many of you know, was a Western boomfront town at our inception. This was kind of a point of departure, a jumping off point for people that were either headed west or folks that were in the agricultural industry further out west, who would then ship goods back east to the larger urban centers. And we know that the vehicle upon which that happened was the what? Anybody? I don't know if I can hear anybody. Is anybody else allowed to speak, or am I the only one allowed to say anything here?
We can unmute ourselves.
You can. All right. Unmute yourself. Yes. Let's make this an interactive conversation.
Erie Canal.
Erie Canal. That's right. It was the Erie Canal, which at its the conclusion of its construction, preceded by just a short time the incorporation of Rochester as a city, which happened in 1834. And all of a sudden, Rochester began to grow like gangbusters. And so in 1834, when the city was incorporated, about 16,000 people that lived here. By 1850, that number had gone up to 36,000. Another 50 years later, it had gone up to 162,000 people. By 1950, it had swelled to 330,000 people, which was its largest size to date. Does anybody know what the current population of Rochester is, roughly? That's right, about I saw you mouth the words, about 200,000. That's correct. It's about 205,000 to 210,000 people that are currently living in this community. So you have rapid population growth. And at the same time as you're getting that rapid population growth, because of the economic engine that the Erie Canal was, it gave way to the rise of innovation in this community. And that innovation ultimately resulted in the creation of some of the well-known companies that define Rochester's history. And of course, those are Kodak, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb. And those companies, and this is an important characteristic of Rochester that a lot of folks miss out on, because in some ways there were some similarities to places like Detroit or Pittsburgh, but in Rochester, these weren't just any old companies. These were the high-tech companies of their day. This was the Alphabet and Google of its day, the Facebook of its day. These were high-tech companies. And so I read a statistic that the manufacturing jobs in Rochester in the 1960s, about 65% of them, a shade over 65% of them, were actually what we would now consider advanced manufacturing. They were instrument-based manufacturing. And the reason why that's important is that these were not the kind of jobs that you could go from the field to the factory floor. Right? There was a different kind of, job base that was here in this town. In many ways, we were Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley. And that's an important defining characteristic for this narrative that I want you to kind of keep in mind. Does anybody know who this is?
Frederick Douglass.
I heard Frederick Douglass. No?
No.
So this is actually Austin Stewart. And Austin Stewart is acknowledged as the first African-American and really the first person of color, save for the native indigenous folks that were here. Austin Stewart is identified as the first African-American to come to Rochester. He came here in around 1801 with a man named Daniel Comstock, and by trade, he was a butcher and he was a grocer. And he set up a store that is on what we now know as Clarissa Street. And again, there's a couple of factoids as we go through that I just want you to keep in mind. So take that little factoid that he was on Clarissa Street. That's where he set up his store, and just tuck that in your back pocket, and we'll revisit that momentarily. But after he came, Rochester's African-American population was started to grow and was relatively steady. Now, is anybody here familiar with the Great Migration? If you can, show me a thumbs up if you know the Great Migration. Very good. I will tell you that I did this presentation for, I've had the good fortune of doing it for some of our universities in town. And I was shocked. I did it for one of our schools and about 150 young folks. And only 4 of those young people were familiar with the Great Migration, which, as an aside, says something about our current education system and its historic accuracy. But suffice it to say that the Great Migration was the largest movement of people really in this country's history, with African Americans going from the primarily southern states where folks had endured the horrific atrocities of slavery, chattel slavery in this country. And at its conclusion, you get the Reconstruction, a very brief moment where there was a really resurgence of growth in African American economics. That was then crushed. The Reconstruction period lasted for a very brief time, about 20 years. And then Reconstruction was ended with a backlash that ultimately resulted in what we know as Jim Crow policies. At the same time, the country was transitioning from primarily an agricultural base to an industrialized country vis-a-vis the Industrial Revolution. And as a consequence, lots of people began to leave the South and go to the North. Some of their own volition, others were attracted by Northern companies. And so that begs the question, in this period, does anybody know the period roughly of the Great Migration? Does anybody here know the years of the Great Migration? So a lot of people mark it as about 1910-ish, 1920 to about 1970. So that's the window. So I want to give anybody a chance to guess what was in light of that fact. Anybody know what Rochester's population was? It's non-white population. So we already know it was 330,000 people overall. But anybody know its non-white population in 1950?
50,000.
20,000.
20,000. Okay, I hear 50,000, 20,000. Let's see here. So my math says if it was 50,000, that would be, about a sixth of the population.
Right. 15%.
So about 15%. All right. Anybody else want to take another guess at a percentage or a number? Does anybody know what it is today? The non-white population in the city of Rochester, just as a percentage.
40%.
40%. Actually, today that's actually for African Americans. Overall, for all non-white people, 62%. About 62%. All right. So if you want to go back on and off, there you go. All right. So 1950, the population in 1950, actually, if you look really close here and kind of scan the page, or just let me tell you, you don't have to look that close. I don't want you to hurt your eyes. But if you add up all those categories, the Rochester's non-white population was about 7,800 people, or 2.3% in 1950. So I want you to keep in mind that this is the period when Rochester is at its largest, 332,000 people living in the city of Rochester, and 7,800 of them were non-white. Imagine what it's like moving through this community, being engaged in this community at that time. 1960 comes along, the population has grown of non-white folks to about 24,000, but the overall population has declined to 318,000. By 1970, the population declines again in overall to 296,000, and the non-white population at this point is about 52,115. And what we're left with is a pretty clear trend line where we have declining overall population, declining white population, but an increasing non-white population. Does anybody know, where did all the white people go?
Suburbs.
Suburbs.
That's correct.
Yeah,
That is correct. And so this trend line is an interesting one, if for no other reason than 2017 was the first time since the 50s that this trend line reversed. So something interesting is happening in this community, even right now as we speak. So let's put it all together. Let's take these pieces that we have. So we've got a Rochester that was a Western Front boomtown, had massive economic growth from the period of 1910 to call it 1950, companies that are being created, capital that's being created, significant growth. But is that shared prosperity? And I would commit to you that during our greatest period of economic growth, the non-white population in Rochester was either absent, on its periphery, or it was excluded. Absent, we just covered. Many people hadn't even gotten here yet. 1950, 200%. To the extent that there were people here like my family who actually came here originally in 1927, many folks were on the periphery. So you had a lot of folks, I don't know if you've ever taken a drive down to Mumford or maybe Medina, driven out to Newark, but there's some fairly sizable African-American populations in each of the places that I just named. And part of the reason why is that when people would come to Rochester, because there weren't those field to factory floor kind of jobs in the city, what a lot of people did do is they did agricultural work in towns around Rochester. And to the extent that people were in the city of Rochester, even the great George Eastman, who funded, by the way, many historically Black colleges and universities like Fisk and Tuskegee, also proclaimed that African Americans would never be allowed to and on those factory floors. And so what we have is a situation where while capital is being created, while businesses are being started, while growth is happening in Rochester, people of color aren't sharing or participating in that growth. And then Black people initially, and then later Latinx people, and then later additional immigrant communities come. By the time that starts to happen, the party's over. And we start to see the seeds of decline for all of the major companies, so that by the 1990s, we had the total disruption of Kodak, Xerox, and Bausch & Lomb. And I will tell you that my father worked for Xerox for 36 years. My dad did. And there was never a moment in my life that I ever thought my dad would pick up the phone and make the call so that I could go to Xerox. And the reason why he never would pick up the phone and make that call is because by the time I was coming of age, Xerox was a dying company. In many ways, we didn't see that as a place. Like, why would I want to go work for Xerox? With all due respect to the folks that are Xerox employees that might be on the call. And so the consequence of that is that you never see the kind of passing of generational wealth and generational resources. You just don't see that happen. And I was one of the lucky few, if you will, in terms of my parents being able to participate in at least some of the back end of some of the economic prosperity that happened in this community. You have generations of people that have never participated in Rochester's economic vitality. Give me 1 second, because I am unplugged. I didn't realize it. So just give me 1 second here. Let me plug back in so we don't lose one another altogether. All righty. And so the ramifications of this are very, very real. And I want you to get a picture of what happens when you see the kinds of conditions begin to emerge in Rochester. Because we also know that at the same time as people of color started to come into the city, and as white people were leaving the city, to the extent that people were participating in the economic vitality of this region, they were also constrained in terms of where they could go, where they could be, and where they could live. And many of you know some of that story, but for those that don't, we'll share. I'm going to share a video. Let me just give you a word of caution. It does start with a word of profanity. If that bothers you, turn off your speakers for about the first 15 seconds, and then you can come back on and rejoin us. Oops.
You know what's so sad, man? You know what's wild? Martin Luther King stood for nonviolence. Now what's Martin Luther King? A street. I don't give a fuck where you in America. If you're on Martin Luther King Boulevard, there's some violence going down.
That, of course, is Chris Rock's famous joke about streets named for Martin Luther King Jr., which tend to be in, let's say, distressed areas. And he's not wrong, because if you look at the way housing segregation works in America, you can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Okay, let's look at MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I want to show you how to see housing segregation in schools, in health, in family wealth, in policing. But first, an explanatory comma. It's the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes. But how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Green meant best area, best people, aka businessmen. Blue meant good people like white-collar families. Yellow meant a declining area with working-class families. And red meant detrimental influences, hazardous, like foreign-born people, low-class whites, and most significantly, Negroes. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for redline neighborhoods is the presence of Black and brown people. Let's be clear, studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable, in most places crime increases, and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to Black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39
Council of Nonviolence in the Civil Rights Movement, has been shot.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any U.S. city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that Black families up and down the income scale have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were Black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still today much harder for a Black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's the feedback loop. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation in health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food, and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, that's the problem. You cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
The problem in our city, the police and the citizens are fighting. They keep targeting my brothers and sisters who don't really have nothing.
And that heavy, aggressive kind of policing that you see in Black neighborhoods in particular makes people feel like they can't trust the police. And when people don't trust the police, crimes go unsolved, and people have to find other ways to keep themselves safe. But of course, it's not just Baltimore, because housing segregation and discrimination fundamentally shape the lives of people in nearly every major American city. It really is in everything.
Of course, this is a map of Rochester. This is our HOLC map, our red line map. Couple of quick historic notes. Number one, the inflection point that they cite in the video was 1968 assassination of Dr. King, which resulted in a number of long, hot summers. But we know that Rochester preceded that by 4 years, that the uprising in Rochester in 1964 was the first in the country of its type. And so that tells us something about the virulent nature of this problem in our community. And if we look at this map, and then we think about where we have disparities in education. We look in this map and we think about where we have disparities in healthcare, where we have disparities in police violence. We don't have a Martin Luther King Boulevard in Rochester, but what we do have, if you can see my mouse, is a Martin Luther King School, which is right around in here. And what this tells us, I mean, you heard the gentleman at the end. So does that sound familiar? Our police and our citizens are at war with one another. Did anybody see what happened last night? Our police and our citizens are at war with one another, with war tools being deployed.
And I was there last night, just wanted to say, horrible.
With the Community Foundation, thank you for sharing. At the Community Foundation, we've been taking a look at geospatial inequity. If you take our current, those HOLC maps, and this will be coming out very shortly. We have a map where you can actually have a depiction of where we see the issues of inequity kind of most pronounced, where communities are under-resourced, where they are deprived. And it is a direct line to what we just saw on those HOLC maps. And that tells us about the character and the nature of poverty here in Rochester. That what we're not talking about is just a few individuals who are not self-sufficient, right? A couple of folks that need to just get a job or pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But instead, we see whole sections of the community that have been deprived of resources. And that's happened now over generations. And so then is it any wonder why we see some of the angst and the frustration that begin to emerge from a community? And when we talk about how that's happened over generations, I can give you share one anecdote that's an example of it. My father was born actually not too far from near the corner of Troop and Jefferson, not too far from where Daniel Prude was murdered on March 23rd, subsequently on the 30th. This area, this kind of highlighted area, is what we now know as Corn Hill. And when you ride through Corn Hill, it belies the history that happened here. Because remember, I told you to tuck in your back pocket that Austin Stewart, when he came, set up his store over on Clarissa Street. And what you have on Corn Hill, and particularly in the Clarissa Street section, is that historically there was a thriving, growing African-American neighborhood. I encourage everybody to check out this new film that our colleagues, we were glad to fund with the Clarissa Street Reunion and the Teen Empowerment and RCTV, Clarissa Uprooted. Please take some time out to go check it out. Also, take a moment to check out this book, The Color of Law. I know some of you have probably already read it. If you haven't, I encourage you strongly to do so. Because what you read in that book are some of the tactics and some of the, frankly, the creativity that was used to preserve the system of hegemonic white supremacy that has defined our systems for so long. One example of that is right here in our own city, on Clarissa Street, where you had this growing, thriving African-American community with doctors and lawyers. I'll tell you guys, I'm 38 years old. Last year was the first time at 37 years old I ever saw a picture of contemporary, of a period Clarissa Street in its heyday. It's a part of our history that's eluded us. that we've lost. The perception that Black people in Rochester have always been in these terrible, dire straits, undermined by this very robust history, doctors, lawyers, stores, and so on and so forth, that were growing. And then the decision was made to drop a highway on top of where RIT used to be located, which was downtown. You want to talk about a twist of fate. The buildings that now are the Rochester City School District's headquarters was actually in the RIT building. They actually it's a refacade. It's the actual building, the Clark building, and the Eastman building sat where the parking lot currently sits. The Bevier building was next door, was the place where arts and crafts were taught. Right adjacent to this African-American community, I invite you to imagine what this community could have looked like if it had been a place that was hospitable to that community, that engaged that community to get trained and to get participate in the growing vitality in the region. I invite you to imagine what a Rochester would have looked like if instead of rebuffing African-Americans, instead folks were engaged to participate and get the training and knowledge. If there was a line, a continuity, a pipeline that took you from RIT into the industries that were growing in this community. I suspect that it's fair to say, and there've been a lot of studies about how diverse thinking helps to solve really challenging problems, but how homogeneity creates lots of blind spots. Like, for example, maybe even missing the digital revolution. I wonder what this community would have looked like, could have been, if we had taken a different tack. And part of that is because the growth of the African-American community was following the same trajectory of other migrant groups until it was halted by explicitly racist policies. Could do a session on Poison Row, which was where the Italian community inhabited along the current day Water Street Music Hall in that area. Little Ireland up near Dewey Avenue. Could have talked about how Jewish brothers and sisters were living right alongside African Americans on the Joseph Avenue corridor. But something happened in this community that denied African Americans the opportunity to continue to follow the same growth trajectory that other communities have followed. And now we are all paying the cost for it. We're all paying the price. But we know that that price is borne on the backs of people of color. And in what way? Well, at the Hard Facts, I saw my colleague, Ann Johnson, on the screen here. I'm glad you joined in. And she could do a whole session herself just to talk about our new Hard Facts update, which in detail goes through and identifies many of the disparities that currently exist in this community. I encourage you to check out actrochester.org, first thing on the screen. Check out the report so you can see in granular detail some of the disparities and how they show up. Things like home ownership. It's what we know, the disparities that begin at birth and continue all the way through childhood and into adulthood. You'd know that my father died at 67 years old, 67. The result of poor health care when he was a kid, of stress being one of the few African Americans working in Xerox at the management level, and the the toll that takes on one's body. That the same forces of white supremacy that shoved Daniel Prue's face into the ground are the same forces that put my father in the grave at an early age. That there's continuity there. And we have to be able to see how these disparities register the same kinds of challenges across the board for people of color. And there's something that is fundamentally wrong about that. In many ways, what we're talking about are two problems that really get realized because in this community, what I hear in a lot of our conversation about either poverty reduction, you know, the euphemisms that we use, right? Poverty reduction, which is really in some ways code word for dealing with people of color. That what we see is the problematization of people of color, right? That we miss the causal relationship of racism and the challenges that we're trying to confront. That we use the wrong unit of analysis when we talk about these kinds of challenges. So for example, what you often hear is this, you know, frankly for me, grading focus on self-sufficiency as what we need to focus on. That if people were just self-sufficient, right? If they were just get a job, if they could just pull themselves up, if they could cross that poverty threshold, then everything would be all right. And I think we can all appreciate that if you look at individuals, that might appear to be true. But again, when we take a step back and we look at community-wide deprivation, then that causes us to think beyond just individuals and to think about some of the basic constructs in our community. How does the economic construct work in Rochester? I contend that when we look at economic activity in Rochester, we can see some things that jump off the screen or should jump off the screen at you. Like, for example, if you look in this first column, what we've attempted to do was to calculate. So the GDP figures are calculated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis down to the county level. We did some work to try to calculate what that number might be for the city of Rochester, right? So the level of economic activity, the gross domestic product, or perhaps even better said, the gross municipal product. Monroe County, $43 billion. City of Rochester, $5.2 billion. What we do know is the income as a hard figure, that's actually reported. $39 billion of income that's generated in Monroe County, 4.5 that's generated in the city of Rochester. Yet when we look at the population, almost 10 times the level of economic activity, but only about double the population. That has to tell us something about the disparity. It jumps off the screen, and we have to ask, how did it get this way? What's the engine that allows us to keep running? When we look at per capita income of $22,000 in the city and $52,000 in our suburban communities, that jumps off the screen as disparity that we have to address. And I would argue that that didn't just randomly happen. This isn't the laws of nature, right? Physics didn't cause this. You know, this isn't, I don't recall Newton proclaiming that this is, you know, a situation that needs to continue to exist. But I would argue that when you look at a lot of the municipal infrastructure, and then we can even look even further than that, but let's just start with the municipal infrastructure. Let's look at our teaching staff, right? And again, we're talking about adverse outcomes, not intent, right? We're not talking about who are good and bad people. We're talking about the outcomes. And we have to speed up. I've got only 5 minutes, so we're gonna do this really quick. Look at the bottom line, $560 million of income. $560 million of salary, benefits, and so on and so forth that RCSD is paying to its staff. Vast majority live outside the city of Rochester. Let's look at the police department. Top line, personnel expenses, $87 million. We know from the city's own data on its new data website that there are 728 officers in the city of Rochester, and only 47 of them actually live in the city of Rochester. Fire, same deal, $47 million worth of expenses. Vast majority of folks that do not reside in the city of Rochester. When you add it all up, we're talking about somewhere in the neighborhood of $700 million of salary and benefits. Out of the door, walking out to our suburban towns, $487 million every single year. That is the definition for how you end up with collapsed markets. And guess what happens in a collapsed market? When you have a collapsed market, there's no stores, there's no businesses. Wegmans says, hey, listen, we used to be in the city, but we can't be because there's nobody to buy our products. That means there's no jobs in the city. And when there are no jobs in the city, guess what else happens? You don't have a job. All of a sudden your economic prospects look dim, but people still have to survive. So then they do what? They get involved in other ways of trying to make money, perhaps even ways that we've deemed illegal, like the illegal narcotics industry. When you're involved in illegal narcotics, you get criminal justice system involved. When your criminal justice system involved, you tend to be away for a while. Maybe people end up with improvised families. Maybe kids start having really difficult circumstances. Maybe because there's no money flowing around, people aren't maintaining homes. We get lead, we get other kinds of environmental hazards, plus the history of environmental hazards in our community. You all follow how you end up with a morass of circumstances because resources have been extracted out of the city. And that's something that we have to contend with. We have to deal with that because we also know that at the time that those resources were being extracted out of the community, people were being locked in because of explicitly racist policies like redlining and restrictive covenants and the other bevy of zoning policies that we heard about in the video. We added it all up. We said if we added the private sector in, we really tried to wrap our heads around, you know, all of it, because the same thing is true in the private sector. The same thing is true in our nonprofit sector. The same thing is true really across the board. When we added it up and tried to get a read on this figure, we ended up about $3 billion leaving the city every year going out to suburban towns. I mean, think about what that means for us. Think about what the implication is. Perhaps you guys saw the catastrophic headline about RCSD suffering most from the county districts with the looming state funding cuts, because in county districts, you've got a tax base that you don't have in the city. In the city of Rochester, the 20% cut registers as a 21% cut. but our friends in Brighton and Pittsburgh only feel it as a 5% cut to the education system there. The choices are a whole lot different when you're dealing with a 5% cut versus a 21% cut. People say, but the city gets so much state aid. You're right, because it has to, because it doesn't have a tax base. And even then, it's insufficient. These are the set of circumstances that we're dealing with. And it leaves us with underdeveloped institutions, with under-resourced efforts to try to solve problems. I'm watching it as our nonprofit sector really just deteriorates and falls apart because of COVID-19. Many of you saw the article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago that Rochester is the most vulnerable city economically to the results of the COVID-19 pandemic because we're so heavily dependent on state aid. Also true in Buffalo, also true in Syracuse, also true down in New York City. These are the circumstances that we're dealing with. And then to add insult to injury, as those dollars leave the city, because we're paying a premium for that constant failure, because the police force doesn't actually, the clearance rate for murders is abysmally low. We all know the educational performance in the city of Rochester, right? We all know this series of data that show us about how systems are failing the people in the city of Rochester. And at the same time, the resources end up in the suburbs subsidizing quality of life. Now I wanna be clear, this isn't a city versus suburbs argument that I'm making. This is that as a region, we have to think about how we thrive, because if you leave a donut hole in the middle of the city, if 30% of our people aren't participating in the economic vitality of our region, then at some point this chicken is gonna come home to roost. And that's what we're seeing right now. That our region is becoming less competitive with comparable regions all across the country. We all have a vested interest in getting this right. Even if right now it feels comfortable to you, we have a vested interest in doing something different and in getting this right. I will tell you this, we are not gonna program our way out of the challenges that we're confronting in this community. I will guarantee you that. My job almost every day is to look at a whole bevy of programs and opportunities that folks are taking. And I can just tell you that the headwinds are too strong. It's too much of an upstream swim to deal with problems by just constantly generating programs. We have got to consider the underlying economic conditions if we're gonna make headway. We've got to rethink how resources flow, how revenue flows, so that we address these adverse outcomes. And we have to do it in a way that's somewhat dispassionate of some of the intent, where we know that people mean to do the right thing. They mean to set up great programs, but at the end of the day, the adverse outcomes continue to accrue generation after generation. Let's start with some low-hanging fruit. Let's get organizations and institutions to transparently share some data so that we know what we're doing and we can start to figure some of this out. You'd be surprised how difficult it is to even amass the right information so that we can make smarter decisions. Let's invest in institutions and take some risk, particularly in communities of color, where communities of color can generate them themselves. This is a critical point, because what we see is that a relatively young community of color in Rochester that's historically been resource deprived doesn't have the kind of institutions that are self-generated, that are self-sustaining. So for those that are interested, we've got to put resources and we've got to let people take the risk and give them the margin of failure to start and try until we can get it right, so that we have more diversity of the kinds of organizations that are solving problems in this community. And finally, we've got to remunerate the end of suffering of Black and Indigenous people of color by Black and Indigenous people of color. And I mean by that, if you think about the history of this country, whether it was slavery, whether it was Jim Crow, the Great Migration, the current prison industrial complex, and each of these cases, this isn't just, like random suffering. People make money. People are making lots of money in the prison industrial complex, as an example. And our response to that can't only be, hey guys, let's go volunteer. The response has to be investing in institutions that ameliorate that suffering, particularly when the ideas are generated from people in communities. So let's encourage people to start schools. Let's encourage people to start drug rehabilitation. Let's encourage people to start the kinds of things that we know can work when they are generated by the community. Let's employ people in the community to solve those challenges. And if we remobilize our resources that way, my sense is that we can start to make at least some headway in solving some of these meaningful challenges that we're confronting in a way that makes all of us stronger as a unified Rochester and as a unified region. With that, I am 2 minutes over, and I promised that I would not drag it out. If anybody's interested though, this is a conversation that I love to be in with folks, particularly when that conversation is oriented towards action. So if you're interested in trying to join up and so we can do something so that we can make a change and we can make this community better and stronger, please feel free. My direct contact information is on the Community Foundation website. And I look forward to hearing from some of you I'm already in conversation with, I see on the screen as friends and colleagues and partners, and others that I haven't had the chance to meet yet. Please, let's be in touch and think about how we can do some of this together. Thank you, guys.